We're here at the Asian Development Bank for a conversation on strengthening disaster preparedness and recovery across Asia. Joining us now is Mr. Kamal Kishore, head of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. Mr. Kishore, it's nice to meet you again. We last spoke also here in Manila during the Asia Pacific Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction 2 years ago. You're back at a very important moment as the region prepares for a possible El Nino. Governments confront increasingly interconnected climate risks, and we enter the final years of the Sendai framework. But I'd like to zero in first on El Nino. You have described the forecast as an earliest warning. As climate change intensifies its impact across water, agriculture, energy, health, and food systems, what actions and governance structure does UNDRR recommend so governments can respond early and treat this risk as one interconnected crisis?
Look, as I said earlier, that El Nino gives us not just early warning, but earliest warning, because El Nino is typically forecasted with a lead time of several months, and the impact of El Nino in terms of extreme weather and climate events in different countries also pan out over several months. We also know what has happened in similar analogous El Nino events in the past in different sectors. So we have time, we have lead time to actually prepare for it and really be ready to respond when different kinds of extreme climate and weather events begin to manifest themselves. So my recommendation for governments is basically threefold. The first thing is that it is really important to have an integrated system of planning for responding to El Nino. It's not just about launching a humanitarian impact. First of all, we have to really do everything we can to minimize the impact. For example, here in Philippines, it's not that all the provinces are going to be affected by drought. We know from previous El Nino events that it's only half of them, and we know which ones those are. But the effect is also not just in agriculture. It's water resources, agriculture, energy, impact on industry. So it is really important that rather than focusing it narrowly on one or two sectors, it's not something which is to be done only by disaster risk management people or agriculture people. It really has to be an integrated response. So setting up an integrated framework, whether it is in the form of a task force or any other mechanism depending on the country's governance context, is really key. The second thing is that it is really important that we start investing time and effort in identifying who's vulnerable, where, in which sectors, in what way. Because unless we do that analysis now, based on what we have learned from previous El Ninos, our efforts to reduce the losses and in some cases actually harnessing potential benefits. There may be some parts of the world which in a normal year get extreme rainfall and flooding, and this year because of El Nino they may get less rainfall and we may have opportunity to have better harvests, for example. So it's really important that there is work done to identify which communities, which sectors, in which geography are vulnerable, how and why, so that this integrated response can build on that understanding. It's not something which is, the policy instruments can't be blunt. They really have to be very specific to specific vulnerabilities across different sectors and across different parts of a country's geography. And the third recommendation I would have is that make money available, make resources available, make capacities available to the local level, because that's where people know what the specific priorities are, what is the specific opportunities. There, if you provide resources, it adds to local initiative, local resourcefulness, and local imagination. And we can guarantee almost that the effect of those interventions will be addressing real world problems and not problems that maybe are not fully understood.
You mentioned to make money available, but even when governments receive credible forecasts, financing is still often mobilized only after losses have occurred. what changes are needed within governments and multilateral development banks so anticipatory financing can be released before climate impacts?
See, the whole issue of anticipatory financing, not just in the context of El Nino, but all hazards, has become very important. We have now at least 10 years of practice to know that if you provide finance in an anticipatory way, 10 years ago we used to call it forecast based financing, it leads to good outcomes. 10 years ago, if somebody told you that let's give money to a community or to a sector in anticipation of an event which hasn't occurred yet, people would say that this doesn't make sense. But we've seen in the last 10 years of anticipatory action that it actually works. How do we scale that now? Even with this movement on anticipatory action and anticipatory financing, only 1% of the total humanitarian spending globally is going to anticipatory action. It has to change. In order for that to happen, it is really important that triggers, the reliability, the confidence, the trust in early warning system is really strengthened further, so that we know that there is a very high likelihood of something happening, what will be the parameters of that event, who will be affected, and that can be used for launching action. So I think clear definition on triggers. The second thing is, it's really important that we pre-identify what are the actions that should be funded, which will give us the right kind of outcome. So I think that planning needs to be done as well. If we did these two things, greater trust in triggers, clear mechanism on when financing is made available, and what is the way, what is the plumbing for that money to flow, I think we can really scale anticipatory action. Good work is happening here in Philippines, where one of the largest, cash disbursement programs is there. Also, the Asian Development Bank is at the forefront of efforts to scale anticipatory action and prearranged finance.
Speaking of the Philippines is pioneering UNDRR's new framework for measuring disaster and climate-related losses to biodiversity and ecosystem service. How can countries with limited data and technical capacity document these losses without being disadvantaged in accessing loss and damage finance?
Over the long term, there is no substitute to having good data. I think one can say that it is very tedious, not very attractive, not very sort of topical work, but it is really important to do this work to understand who's affected, where they are affected, in what way they are affected, so that we have a better understanding of risks, we have a better understanding of who's vulnerable, in what ways. So I really think that that investment is necessary. It's necessary not just for accessing international resources, but also necessary for better targeting of domestic resources. But till we have that, we should use whatever mechanisms we have. There are now AI-based tools which can give us a pretty good handle on what is being lost, where, etc. So we should use that. But over the long term, it's really important that we have robust data on impacts, both economic impact as well as non-economic impacts.
And speaking of mechanisms, are indigenous and local knowledge recognized in the framework?
Oh, absolutely. I think indigenous and local knowledge is not optional. I think that's not an add-on. That actually is the starting point.
The Philippines is also the chairman of the ASEAN this year, and the country is spearheading the Manila Aspect Framework for Regional Disaster Response. From UNDRR's perspective, what should the framework contain to ensure faster, science-based, and coordinated ASEAN responses to climate-related disasters that cross national borders?
We really commend from UNDRR side the evidence-based, science-based approach that Philippines is promoting. And we really hope that this is something that will be discussed in depth at ASEAN, and this will become a basis for a lot of the work that ASEAN is doing on disaster risk management in a collaborative frame. So overall, it is the right direction, and we really hope that this comes to fruition.
But we know that the ASEAN already has AAD, MER, and the AHA Center. What specific gap should ASPEC fill in?
I think this whole evidence-based approach, much greater rigor on bringing in science for informing action is something that is a value addition to it. And Philippines has lived experience of doing this across multiple hazards.
And speaking of lived experience, that brings us to the Early Warnings for All initiative. With the 2027 deadline approaching, what must change urgently to ensure the universal coverage means people actually have the financing, support, connectivity, and social protection needed to act on warnings?
You see, there are three things. We've made a lot of progress under early warning for all. Now, more than nearly 130 countries report having multi-hazard early warning systems. That's great progress, but there are still almost one third of world's countries that do not have multi-hazard early warning system. I believe that to accelerate progress between now and 2027, there are three things that need to be done. One is it's really important that we mobilize resources for countries that require these resources from international sources, but also from domestic sources. Because the investment in early warning system is not something that you do once. You may have a good project which elevates the quality of early warning system in a particular country, but it needs to be sustained forever. And that requires a predictable way of financing different aspects of early warning systems. The second area is that we really need to see how some of the hazards where forecasting and early warning needs to be improved, some aspects such as access to technology for dissemination. Right now, for example, less than 40 countries across the world have implemented cell broadcast, and we know cell broadcast is the gold standard for dissemination. Why is it just 40 countries? It should be 100%. So I think these gaps on looking at some hazards, some dissemination technologies is really something that we need to address. And finally, I would like to see much greater national ownership across the board of early warning system. This is really something which needs to be looked at not as a project, but something which is a permanent social good for a society. It is not something that you do once, it is something that you build for society forever as a common good.
And speaking of deadlines, we're also nearing the Sendai Framework 2030 deadline. Which of the targets need the most attention in Asia and the Pacific? And what progress should government demonstrate at APNCDRR in 2027 at Sendai?
See, in Asia Pacific, we've made a lot of progress. Mortality from disasters has come down significantly in some countries, up to 65% decade on decade. More countries now than ever before have a national and subnational strategy for disaster risk reduction. So if I use the traffic light system, these are the two targets which are green. There are three targets which are deep red, which are of big concern. We are not reducing the number of people affected by disasters, we are not reducing economic losses, and we are not reducing infrastructure disruptions. We've made progress in early warning systems, we've improved international cooperation. So you can call those two yellow. So I really think that for Asia Pacific now the next leap is to reduce economic losses. And to do that, it is really important that disaster risk reduction is embedded in everything we do, in all development planning, in all investments. Every school, every hospital, every highway, every airport, every railroad that we build, every renewable energy project we build must be resilient to impacts of different kinds of hazards. If we did that, we will be able to move beyond saving lives to also saving livelihoods and ensuring that everyone in this region flourishes.
And finally, we already talked about a lot of recommendations from your side, but before we end, of all the compounding climate risks facing Asia and the Pacific, what is that one single thing that governments are still underestimating?
I think my big concern is not a single hazard, but when one hazard leads to another hazard, and that leads to another hazard, and it becomes a compound hazard. And sometimes when it affects systems which have, not just regional but global connections. For example, what happens if our digital infrastructure, such as data centers or submarine cables or satellite systems, are affected by natural hazards. I think we are probably not fully recognizing the extent of risk we have in some of these areas and how systemic that risk is, and to what extent we really need to bring about a systemic thinking to risk reduction and not just reduce risk in a particular location for a particular community and for a particular system or a sector. It is really important that we see the interconnections fully and take a systemic view of disaster risk reduction.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kishore. It was nice talking to you again.
Likewise, thank you.